We're the Vinyl Verdict, and today we're doing a Beatles release, and we wanted to go way back to really the first thing recorded, but one of the last things released, and that's the Star Club album. And there's a lot of history behind the album, and there's a lot of rumors today about a potential re-release using maybe some AI technology. So this is a series of songs, 15 never before released tracks, and that means not released on, the covers that are on here that are not from albums. All that was known at the time was it was 62. The Star Club opened up in April 62, sometime around then. Then they kind of zeroed in on it probably being from New Year's Eve 62. Now it is believed to have been, and there's obviously many more songs. There's about 2 hours of it floating out there that's believed to be from a number of different nights in the last week of December. And I think some folks have even figured out exactly which songs go with which evening. And this is kind of the end of the Beatles' last residency in Hamburg. They obviously got their 10,000 hours playing there, and when they came back to Liverpool, they were a different band, and that story's been told again and again. But even after, this is the end of 1962. So for context, Love Me Do was released in October of 62. So they already have a hit, minor hit, but it's out there on the charts. And Ringo had just joined the band in August. So this is kind of, now they're finding their groove, their lineup, and they're starting to have some real success. And this is, always been told is they didn't really want to go back to Hamburg and play this show. You would never know it from the energy on these sets, but it's kind of unknown what their feelings were, so it's captured as like their last real performance before they'd go back to the UK and start really getting big, and in 63 playing the Cavern and getting bigger and bigger, and this is on the eve of all that success, and I think that's the way that the story's always been told. It's really one of the nicer clubs. I went there when I was in Hamburg a couple years ago, and compared to the Reeperbahn and some of these other places that were along there, I think it was it had 2,000 person seating capacity. This version was released in April 1977 on record. Didn't do that hot. It charted to 111 on the charts. I think there were multiple versions of it from different labels, and it kind of borders on bootleg. At the time, it wasn't really a bootleg because you could buy it in a store, but since that time, there have been lawsuits about it. Famously, George Harrison attended a lot of them in the 90s, and he in the box even said this is the crummiest recording with the Beatles' name on it and stuff like that. Lennon at the time was still alive in 77, 78, and he said some pretty negative things about it as well. Nobody ever has spoken positively about this within the Beatles camp. Got a lot of 2-star reviews, but interesting comments. It's like one hell of a party going on next door, which I think, you're not completely immersed in it. The quality's not there, but you can feel the energy of it. Rolling Stone called it the best bar band of all time, and that any other act would be terrified to follow this on stage. And so, since 77, it was in that contested state. In 98, the Beatles did win that lawsuit. So they have the rights to these recordings, and it's never been legally released since. Now, Peter Jackson has confirmed that his team used the MAL machine learning software to actually isolate and improve this recording, and a lot of folks have tried to do that unofficially as well. And so it'll be really interesting if we get a version of this that sounds like you're in the room with them rather than the room next door. Yeah, that might be coming. My other takeaways is I think it shows how many songs George sang as well, which wasn't really the case in the Beatles live set. He maybe did one or something as a feature, but here he's pretty close to equally represented. I didn't do the exact tally, but I hear his voice a lot more. It's also known for a lot of the banter. They're not as polished, they're not as charming as they're going to be on the Ed Sullivan Show in a year and a half, or less, really. But it's kind of like, John Lennon provoking them, yelling things in German.
Well, he had an almost adversarial type of, 15 years since the war ended when they first went there, 16 years. And since the major bombing of Hamburg, and maybe 17 years, it's just wild that they were there. Not that much time had passed in the big scheme of the universe, and that's the chemistry lab where they came together like that is an amazing thing.
Yeah,
playing in Hamburg, that is. But the thing about this when it came out was this was quality. This was going to be not those bootleg type things. This is the first, I recall, the first real legitimate record that was released with the Beatles in the nicest club they ever played in Hamburg, kind of at the end of their Hamburg career and the dawn of their of the fame that was about to hit. And there was such a vibe to it that you really did feel like you're back in a time machine, seeing them and hearing them. And so that was exciting about this record. There weren't, there was, as I say, some underground or bootleg things here and there, but this was a legitimate release where you're hearing the stage pattern, you're hearing the individual guys, you're hearing which guy does a lead vocal on this or that, and it's the whole show you're hearing. So I was excited to get it, and it didn't knew it wasn't an original Beatle album. Beatles was great to hear Ask Me Why, and you wondered, Ask Me Why was they were performing that live? I mean, I always loved the song, but that's the first one they performed live. It was kind of a surprise, and it was exciting to get this record. Like you're on a different view of the Beatles than you ever had.
It was notoriously, it's the one where it's just almost unlistenable, and it's historically interesting, but the quality is just not there to enjoy it. I'm always shocked that it got such a nice vinyl release and everything. Maybe it was different.
There was an element of making what's done now, I think, on a much bigger scale, maybe with the re-releases. I don't know if everyone would agree with that, but the idea that there's money to be made. But such was the fame that listen to it in the beginning, put it on the turntable more than once, and then it kind of faded away and went into the Beatle records that I had. I never really listened to it too much after that initial run.
Yeah, and then I think with the BBC stuff coming out in the 90s, that totally replaced this. I mean, that's why they name and re-release like Hollywood Bowl until much later. I think
that's true too.
This is also almost halfway between the Decca audition, which was done, I think, January 1st, 62, and Ed Sullivan Show was, February 64? So this is pretty close to the middle. You're getting a slice of them where they've come a long way since that Decca audition, but they're not on that national stage. And they're not really even they're getting there on the UK stage a little bit.
I do think I recall hearing that here's a version, here's the Star Club, here's where they went back to Hamburg, here's where they went back after Stuart Sutcliffe had passed away and they found that out. Their hearts weren't in this Hamburg visit. I think is something that I think was out at that time or something, but it's not going to stop you from buying it. And then when you hear it, as you said, you can't believe that because it's alive and cooking for a club act or something. I mean, they were.
I think that's really questioned. It was a 2-week residency also. They did stuff that was much worse than that in terms of the commitments they were making. So I don't know. They sound like they want to be there, or they sound comfortable, I should say. It sounds like a very familiar crowd, familiar set list, and you don't get that. 63, they feel a little bit sometimes unsure. Like the crowds are getting larger and larger, and there's a little bit of nervous energy in those performances that's not present here. This is like you came into their house, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And it is 1 year to the day from Decca, which is also notoriously a very nerve-wracking recording, and they're musically having a couple issues in there and just not having the confidence that clearly they have in this club environment. So this is so much more raw, and that's where it gets that thing of punk before punk. A lot of people will say that about this album.
It is raw.
But they couldn't translate that exactly. Yeah, obviously his vocals are strained, but they didn't have control of production in the studio on BBC and Please Please. Here it's like they had the total stagecraft. They could go move their amp however they wanted it. They could control the set list, and so I think this is way more authentic, and it's before Brian Epstein really started getting involved and polishing up their act. And it seems, again, in 62, it feels early to me. This is a different era. This is not even, there's no British invasion yet.
No, there's not.
This is like Earth Angel era. Yeah. And they're doing just every song is this heavy rock version.
That's right.
And so it's questionable, I think, from a commercial standpoint at the time. Again, if you're in the Reeperbahn in 1962, I guess it's a good one to like bang your head to and break glasses to. I don't think it would have appealed to the masses if it was released, and I don't think today it appeals to the masses.
No, for different reasons, but at that time the business was different. It was also moribund, or if that's the word, or just there were individual guy singers, and it was the era of Fabian and everybody else. And
the other big myth of the Beatles is that they were so great in the studio, they weren't a great live band. I think this comfortably disproves that.
Hence John's remark about that they peaked as a performing band in Hamburg, which always sounded a little weird.
Which is so weird that he says that, and then they refuse to ever release anything from that era, right? Yeah. So in terms of track by track, I won't get into all the details, but I grouped some of them together. I think so. You get the opening with the waiter Fred Fasher singing Bebop-A-Lula, and then he does his dedication to the barmaid Bettina. I mean, this is like really weird, intimate stuff. It's like a random night.
Who gave the preluding pills to them to stay up.
And they have a lot of swing songs in here. I think you said that when you're talking, but like Hallelujah, I Love Her, Red Sails in the Sunset, Your Feet's Too Big, which is one of my personal favorites. McCartney's Young Screams, and even like Mr. Moonlight they sped up. But those all have like a swing feel to them, and I think Ringo really brings that in. And they didn't have that on any official studio recordings, I think, to that degree. No. Then you got the punk song. So I said Red Hot, which it's got to be George's voice, but you never hear him that raspy. Kansas City, we know, but it's a little bit more raw even than he'd do it on Beatles for Sale. Roll Over Beethoven sounds like twice as fast. Hippie Hippie Shake, and then Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry, and Ringo's drum fills in there, obviously. That's where I think the punk feel comes from a lot of stuff. They're playing these songs at like 150, 160 BPM. I don't know that there's any Beatles songs that were that fast later on. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there are a couple ballads sprinkled in there, not as many as they would do later. Till There Was You. Where Have You Been All My Life is the Lennon one that people really like, but the recording's kind of rough. Besame Mucho, and then Falling in Love Again, and so there's these really slow ballads in the middle too.
Yeah, originally a Marlene Dietrich song.
To Nowhere Is to Love Her, the 62 version, they're clearly on uppers, and then Lennon's version in 75 is clearly on downers. It's like the slowest version of the song you can, so you can see that difference.
Probably.
Same guy singing too.
Probably.
And then there's a couple country songs, not as much as later, but like Lend Me Your Comb and maybe Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby.
That's
not
true.
as many as George would get into, I think, and they get more of that like acoustic influence later on, but a couple different genres that they get into here. So
I guess I was a Beatle nut because I listened to all of it, and that's how I learned some of these older songs and stuff, and loved them, whatever they played. I love.
McCartney has a very different early. I mean, everyone talks about Lennon's voice kind of changed in '66, and he could never get back into that rock voice. McCartney's voice really changes after Please Please. Like he can do a lot of the same kind of slightly flat, like sliding up to the note thing, and he does it on Please Please Me, and then I think he kind of drops it even after that. And it gets a lot of that sound where it's almost like this American accent that he's putting on some of these songs. And they sound pretty proficient at their instruments. So this is at the end of that 10,000 hours compared to, some of the early sessions from like 1960 and stuff. There might be, people talk about George had a couple little flubs, but it's mostly improvised, and it's a lot of songs. And I think, he holds his own. The Lennon rhythm parts are really, that is the best I think he ever got at rhythm. He's just driving these songs. Ringo's drums have never felt bigger. I think some of that's obviously the acoustics of the room and where this mic is. And then Paul, just the pumping bass, which was mixed down, but I think some of this AI has allowed it to be mixed up. And his ad-libs, I think, just make it. He's really just off the cuff on a lot of these songs.
It was a photo and a photograph of them at a moment in time, which otherwise you wouldn't have. And it's not the early struggling days exactly, and it's not the real, Beatlemania days for sure yet. And so it has its own little niche that you wouldn't maybe have been aware of otherwise. You read it in a history book or you see it in a Beatle movie. This is it on an album. You can hear it in their music, and they're standing on the edge of what was to be probably the biggest thing in the world in music that was about to happen. So for that reason, it's interesting.
Let us know, what do you think of the Star Club? This is one of the more divisive releases, I think, or even recordings of the Beatles. And so, curious, it seems like it's getting a bit of a re-examination. So, what are your thoughts?